Dar and 4:17 a.m., Gulf of Oman, April 19th. The water is glass, no wind, no waves, just the low hum of turbines beneath the surface of a sea that has carried oil, commerce, and civilization for 3,000 years. Then the lights come on. USS Abraham Lincoln, battle group formation, guided missile destroyers flanking port and starboard, helicopters lifting off the flight deck before most of the world has had its first cup of coffee. At exactly that moment, a 900-foot Iranian cargo vessel named the Tuska makes a decision that will reverberate far beyond this stretch of water. It ignores the warning, not a miscommunication, not a technical failure, a deliberate choice. 40 seconds later, a hole appears in the engine room. The Tuska goes dead in the water. U.S. Marines fast rope onto the deck. The blockade has drawn first blood. Every mainstream headline will tell you this is American strength on full display, and they are not wrong. But here is the question nobody in that news cycle is asking. What happens next? Not in the Gulf of Oman, not on the surface, underneath, in the architecture of retaliation that Iran has been quietly constructing for 40 years. That is what this video is actually about. Before we go any further, let me tell you exactly what you are going to walk away with after the next 20 minutes. First, why this blockade is not the finishing move Washington thinks it is. It may be the opening trap of something far more dangerous. Second, the asymmetric counterattack mechanism that Tehran is quietly activating right now. Not with missiles, not with proxies, with something that hits harder and leaves no fingerprints. Third, 3 specific scenarios for where this goes from here. One of them has a very high probability of triggering a systemic repricing of global energy markets before the end of this quarter. If you found this channel in the last 24 hours, hit subscribe right now. Not tomorrow, now, because everything I just described is moving faster than the news cycle can track. By the time the headlines catch up, the positions will already be taken. The people who understand this early are the ones who are never caught off guard. Let us get into it. Here is what the mainstream narrative wants you to believe. America has 2 carrier strike groups in the region, B-2 bombers on standby, a naval blockade that has effectively strangled Iranian oil exports. The regime is in disarray. Their missile factories have been decimated. Their air defense systems are being relocated in panic. Their leadership does not even know who is in charge. On the surface, this looks like a checkmate. It is not. And the moment you start believing it is, you have already lost the plot. Let me dismantle 3 illusions that are quietly dominating the way people are thinking about this conflict, because these illusions are not just wrong, they are strategically dangerous. Illusion number 1, the illusion of absolute power. Washington is operating from a paradigm built in the 1990s, shock and awe, overwhelming force, precision strikes that decapitate command structures and collapse regimes within weeks. That playbook worked in Iraq in 2003. It worked because Iraq was a conventional state with conventional dependencies. Iran is not that. Iran has spent 4 decades being sanctioned, isolated, bombed by proxy, and economically strangled. What does not kill a system makes it adaptive. The Islamic Republic has not survived this long by being fragile. It has survived by building redundancy into everything. Redundant leadership, redundant weapons programs, redundant revenue streams running through networks that do not appear on any Treasury Department spreadsheet. The person who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in any negotiation. That is not a metaphor. That is the operating reality inside Tehran right now. Illusion number 2, the illusion of Iranian isolation. Every analyst pointing at empty SAM sites and disrupted supply chains is telling you half the story. Yes, Iran's conventional military capacity has been degraded significantly, but conventional military capacity is not the only form of strategic power. Iran's real arsenal was never in its missile factories. It was in its geography, its relationships, and its absolute willingness to make everyone around it pay a price. Illusion number 3. The illusion that Hormuz is the only chessboard. Every camera in the world is pointed at the Strait of Hormuz right now. every analyst, every algorithm, every defense ministry. That is precisely where Tehran wants your attention. While the world watches one strait, three other pressure points are being quietly armed, not with weapons, with leverage. And leverage in the right hands is more destructive than any bomb the B-2 has ever carried. Now we get to the part that nobody in the mainstream coverage is talking about, not because the information is classified, but because understanding it requires connecting dots across economics, military logistics, and geopolitical architecture simultaneously. And that kind of synthesis does not fit inside a 3-minute news segment. So let me give you 3 announcements, 3 mechanisms, 3 ways that Iran could theoretically inflict catastrophic damage without firing a single missile at an American asset. Announcement number 1, the choke point that makes Hormuz look small. Everyone knows about the Strait of Hormuz, 20% of global oil supply, the obvious pressure point, the one that gets all the attention. Here is what gets no attention: the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow corridor between Yemen and the Horn of Africa, connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. Approximately 12% of all global maritime trade passes through this bottleneck every single day. Container ships, liquefied natural gas tankers, the supply chains feeding European manufacturing floors that operate on just-in-time inventory models with zero buffer capacity. Iran does not need to physically close this strait. Tehran has spent years cultivating relationships with actors in that region who have already demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to make that waterway extraordinarily dangerous. A single credible escalation signal from Tehran to its network in that theater could theoretically spike marine insurance premiums to levels that make shipping economically non-viable. When shipping becomes non-viable, the ships stop moving. When the ships stop moving, the factories stop producing. When the factories stop producing, European governments face a domestic economic crisis that immediately dilutes their political appetite for supporting American pressure on Iran. This is not a military strategy. This is a supply chain weapon. And it does not leave fingerprints. Announcement number 2, the intelligence asymmetry that inverts the power equation. Here is a scenario that the defense community is quietly discussing, but that almost nobody in public analysis is willing to say out loud. China is not sending weapons to Iran. That is the official position, and there is no verified evidence to contradict it directly. But weapons are not the only form of strategic support. Certain Chinese commercial satellite operators are capable of providing imagery at sub-half-meter resolution. That level of resolution means you can identify individual vessels, track their movement patterns, and calculate firing solutions in near real time. Before the conflict entered its current phase, Iranian targeting capability for maritime assets was considered relatively limited. The kind of precision required to threaten a guided missile destroyer in open water was largely beyond their independent technical reach. If that gap has been closed, even partially through commercial or quasi-commercial intelligence sharing arrangements, then the strategic calculus inside the Gulf of Oman changes completely. The question worth asking is not whether the U.S. Navy can sink Iranian assets. Of course it can. The question is what the risk profile looks like for sustained blockade operations when the adversary potentially has real-time positional awareness of every asset in the theater. Who is actually encircling whom? Announcement number 3, the psychological nuclear weapon called Pickaxe Mountain. Let me give you a number, 300 feet. That is the estimated depth of Iran's most hardened underground nuclear facility, based on assessments that have circulated in open-source analytical circles. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the deepest penetrating conventional weapon in the American arsenal, is designed to defeat targets at depths approaching 200 feet under optimal conditions. Do the arithmetic. This is not an accident of engineering. Iran did not accidentally build a facility 100 feet deeper than the most powerful bunker buster on the planet. This was a deliberate architectural decision communicating a very specific strategic message. The message is this: you cannot end this program with bombs. You can damage it, you can delay it, but you cannot terminate it through conventional air power alone, which means any military campaign that does not include ground operations or tactical nuclear options cannot achieve the stated objective of eliminating the Iranian nuclear program. And ground operations in Iran, a country of 89 million people with significant mountainous terrain and a deeply embedded revolutionary guard infrastructure, is a scenario that even the most hawkish voices inside the Pentagon are not seriously proposing. Tehran is not just building a facility. Tehran is building an argument. A structural, architectural, geological argument that says the only path to a genuine resolution runs through negotiation, not through the Bombay doors of a B-2. That argument, whether you agree with it or not, has significant strategic weight. 3 announcements, 3 mechanisms. None of them require a single Iranian soldier to fire a single round at an American target. This is what asymmetric warfare looks like in 2025. Not tanks, not dogfights, choke points, information architecture, and the geometry of the underground. Let me show you how the people who actually move markets are reading this situation, because there is a gap between what politicians say and what money does. And money, unlike politicians, cannot afford to lie. In the 90 seconds following the first confirmed reports of the Tusca interdiction, quantitative trading algorithms at major energy desks in London, Singapore, and Chicago began systematically repricing their entire forward exposure to Middle Eastern supply disruption. Not because a human analyst made a phone call, because the models detected a threshold crossing, a point beyond which the probability distribution of outcomes shifts from manageable volatility into tail risk territory. That repricing happened before any government spokesperson had finished their first prepared statement. Smart money does not wait for certainty. Smart money prices in probability. And right now, the probability being priced into energy derivatives, shipping insurance instruments, and certain defense sector positions tells a very different story than the confident tone you are hearing from official briefings. That is the market's version of the truth. Now, let me give you the philosophical version. Sun Tzu wrote roughly 2,500 years ago that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, not to defeat them on the battlefield, to make the battlefield itself irrelevant. Henry Kissinger, who spent 50 years navigating exactly these kinds of strategic confrontations, observed that nations do not have permanent friends or permanent enemies. They have permanent interests. The critical analytical question in any escalating conflict is never who is winning the current engagement. It is whose underlying interests are being served by the escalation itself. Ask that question here, and the answer becomes genuinely uncomfortable for the simple narrative. And then there is this. According to assessments circulating in certain diplomatic analytical circles, which have not been independently verified, but which align with observable behavioral patterns, Tehran may currently be exploring back-channel communication through at least 2 non-Western intermediary states. The goal, if these assessments are accurate, would be to construct a framework for a bilateral arrangement that entirely bypasses the current negotiating architecture. Not a deal with Washington, a deal around Washington. If that hypothesis has even a 30% probability of being accurate, it restructures everything you think you know about who holds the leverage in this situation. This is the part where most analysts get lazy. They gesture vaguely toward uncertainty. They say things like, the situation remains fluid, or all options are on the table. They protect themselves from being wrong by never being specific. I am going to do the opposite. 3 scenarios, specific probabilities, specific mechanisms, specific implications for anyone trying to understand where this goes. Scenario 1, the off-ramp, probability 25%. In this scenario, a back-channel agreement surfaces within the next 60 to 90 days. Iran accepts a framework that allows it to claim it negotiated from a position of strength rather than capitulation. The blockade is lifted in phases, tied to verifiable compliance benchmarks monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Oil flows resume. Shipping insurance premiums collapse back toward historical norms. Markets exhale. This sounds like the best outcome. And in narrow terms, it is. But here is what the headlines will not tell you when this happens. This is not peace. This is a structured pause. Iran's fundamental strategic objective, achieving a nuclear deterrent capability that permanently alters its position in the regional power hierarchy, does not disappear because a document gets signed in some neutral capital. It goes underground, literally and figuratively. The clock does not stop. It simply becomes less visible. Anyone positioning for a genuine long-term stabilization of Middle Eastern energy supply based on this scenario is making a category error of historic proportions. Scenario 2, the slow burn. Probability, 50%. No deal. No full-scale war. Instead, something far more economically devastating than either. The blockade extends beyond 90 days. Iranian proxy networks begin systematically elevating the cost of Red Sea transit through sporadic but unpredictable interdiction activity. Marine insurance underwriters in London classify the entire corridor as a war risk zone. The rerouting of container traffic around the Cape of Good Hope adds approximately 14 days to European supply chains. 14 days does not sound catastrophic until you map it against just-in-time manufacturing dependencies across German automotive supply chains, French pharmaceutical logistics, and Southern European energy infrastructure. Simultaneously, oil prices stabilize at levels high enough to generate significant fiscal pressure on import-dependent economies while simultaneously funding the very Iranian parallel revenue networks that sanctions were designed to eliminate. The blockade, in this scenario, becomes a mechanism that hurts everyone except the most sanctions-hardened actors in the system. This is the scenario I assess as most probable, not because it is anyone's preferred outcome, but because it requires the least coordination to sustain and generates the most distributed pain across the maximum number of stakeholders. Distributed pain without a clear villain is the hardest political problem to solve, and it can persist for a very long time. Scenario 3, the black swan, probability 25%. A single event that nobody has specifically wargamed triggers a cascade that no one can reverse. It could be a miscalculation during a boarding operation that results in significant American casualties. It could be a successful strike on a Gulf Cooperation Council energy facility that gets attributed accurately or otherwise to Iranian-linked actors. It could be a cyber attack on critical financial infrastructure timed to coincide with a moment of maximum market vulnerability. Any one of these events crosses a threshold that transforms political calculation into political compulsion. Leaders who might prefer restraint find themselves inside a domestic political environment that makes restraint impossible. This is the scenario that sophisticated institutional investors are quietly hedging against right now, not because they think it is the most likely outcome, but because it is the outcome with the most catastrophic asymmetric downside. When the potential loss is civilizational in scale, even a 25% probability demands serious preparation. The black swan does not announce itself. That is definitionally what makes it a black swan. 3 paths. One pause that solves nothing permanently, one slow economic hemorrhage that most people will not recognize as a crisis until they are already inside it, and one sudden discontinuity that restructures everything overnight. The question is not which one you prefer. The question is which one you are prepared for. Let me leave you with the only rule that has never failed in 4,000 years of recorded geopolitical history. The person who needs the deal less always wins. Not the person with the most weapons. Not the person with the most allies. Not the person with the most sophisticated military technology floating in the Gulf of Oman right now. The person who can absorb pain longer than the other side can politically sustain inflicting it. Washington has overwhelming force. Tehran has accumulated tolerance for suffering that has been pressure tested across 4 decades of sanctions, isolation, and targeted destruction. These are not equivalent assets, but they are not as mismatched as the headlines suggest. History does not remember who had the superior carrier strike group. History remembers who was still standing when the other side ran out of political will. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every confident briefing coming out of Washington right now. So here's the question I am leaving with you today. Which of those 3 scenarios do you think is actually unfolding? And more importantly, what does your answer mean for how you are thinking about the next 90 days? Leave your assessment in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because the next move in this sequence may happen before sunrise tomorrow.